Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on the current landscape of patient-generated data and data privacy. This webinar is being organized by the National Health Council, by Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and by ISPOR's Real World Evidence Special Interest Group. My name is Elisabeth Oehrlein, and I'm at the National Health Council, and I will be moderating today's session. Next slide, please. In case you're not familiar with the National Health Council, we're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., made up of more than 140 diverse organizations aligned in our interests to work on behalf of patients with chronic conditions. And the majority of our members are voluntary health agencies or patient advocacy groups, and their logos are represented here. And we decided to organize this series on real-world data and real-world evidence because over the past several years, our patient group members have let us know that learning about RWE and RWD is a priority for them. Next slide, please. So to get started, just a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and it'll be available on our website afterwards. Please do stay on mute throughout the presentation, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function to submit questions throughout the duration, but we will hold all questions until the end of the presentations. Next slide, please. And we wanted to just be sure to acknowledge folks who have helped us to organize this session. We have received support from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, through a Eugene Washington PCORI Engagement Award. We'd also like to acknowledge our advisory board members who are all listed here. And a special thank you to Lucinda Orsini for this particular session. She serves as Associate Chief Science Officer at ISPOR, and she's helped us to co-sponsor and co-organize this particular webinar with ISPOR's RWE Special Interest Group. Next slide, please. So just a reminder or an FYI in case this is your first time attending one of our webinars, this webinar is part of a larger series that we're organizing. The topics on the left are ones that have already been covered, and they are already available as a recording on our website. And then we'll be continuing in 2021 until April of 2021 with a variety of additional webinars. And here are some of the topics. We're also working on some infographics and a glossary as well. So I would like to now introduce our speakers. I'm very, very excited and honored to be joined today by Corey Dennis and Craig Lipset, two experts in this topic. So Corey Dennis is Lead U.S. Privacy Officer at Sanofi. And at Sanofi, Corey is responsible for managing the U.S. privacy program in compliance with all privacy laws impacting U.S. operations and facilitating digital health, patient data, real-world evidence, and data strategy-related matters. Prior to joining Sanofi, Corey was Director of Privacy and Counsel at PPD, which is a global clinical research organization where he was responsible for managing global privacy matters, including a team of privacy officers in both regions. He's actively participating in a number of professional associations and has written and spoken extensively on privacy law. So Corey, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm also honored to be joined by Craig Lipset, who's the founder of Clinical Innovation Partners, where he provides advisory and board leadership of pharma, tech, venture capital, and others to bring vision and driving action at the intersection of research, digital solutions, and patient engagement. He was formerly head of clinical innovation and venture partners at Pfizer, and served on the founding operations committee for Transcellular Biopharma and on the founding management teams for two successful startup ventures. He also serves as an adjunct assistant professor at Rutgers University, an adjunct instructor at University of Rochester, and serves on a number of board of directors, including the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. And so with that, without further ado, I'd like to first turn it over to Corey, and then we'll hear from Craig. And just a reminder, feel free throughout the webinar to submit questions through the Q&A function. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for that really outstanding introduction. I'm very glad to be here today to speak to the audience regarding patient privacy, data privacy, and all of the implications with respect to patient-generated data. This is very much a timely topic. It's a challenging topic. It's one that has quickly emerged to the fore in terms of, within the pharma industry generally. We're seeing more and more collection of data, the use of big data. Big data is a phenomenon that has really taken hold, even starting back many years ago, and has taken on increased importance now, in particular in the COVID era, where we're now moving or accelerating quickly into the digital world, quickly into this virtual era that we now live in. And so, from my perspective, we are seeing more and more patient-generated data. We're seeing more innovations and technologies that are implicating data privacy-related concerns. And at the same time, we have the challenge of the laws essentially trying to keep up with these new technologies. And so it's been really interesting over the past few years to be focusing on privacy within the healthcare space. The US historically has had privacy laws in the consumer protection space, really focusing on consumer protection and in the area of data breach in particular. And then, of course, Europe has historically had a different framework, which has evolved over time with the recently enacted GDPR a couple of years ago. And now what we're seeing is the US essentially trying to catch up with Europe with the new California privacy law. And many of us in the field are grappling with the challenges that introduces. So it's very much an interesting area. It's one involving, essentially a minefield of laws and regulations, risk and liability. And so the role as a privacy officer, within a global pharmaceutical company involves building out policies and procedures to establish, compliance mechanisms and to balance these considerations against the need to collect this data and the compliance obligations. So with that being said, that's a bit of an overview of my presentation, which will be brief today, and I will obviously have the opportunity to take questions as well. But if you could please go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Europe has had in place since May 2018 the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Many of you may be familiar with this law. In many ways, it introduced a number of challenging obligations with respect to the collection of personal information, which is broadly defined. And interestingly, the GDPR was really not the first privacy law within Europe. Prior to the GDPR, they had in place the General or the Data Protection Directive, which was quite similar to the GDPR, except that the GDPR has created a higher level of stringency, a higher level of fines and penalties, which includes penalties of up to 4% of global revenue. We are now seeing enforcement of the GDPR, including some very substantial fines and penalties of over $100 million against several different entities, including most recently Google and Amazon. So this is certainly a law that requires a number of mechanisms to be in place from a compliance perspective in terms of policies, procedures, privacy impact assessments, evaluating new vendors, new projects and initiatives, including in the digital space. And so this slide essentially lays out some of those obligations, really very high level overview in a nutshell, some of the requirements of the GDPR. So I'm just speaking generally to the obligations of the GDPR. This is not a presentation on the GDPR, which there have been many. There have been many on discrete topics that relate to the GDPR. And one of the most recent and challenging issues under the GDPR has been the issue of cross-border data transfer. So how do we transfer data outside of Europe in a way that is lawful based upon the GDPR's requirements? And this continues to be a challenge, including because the European regulators have recently invalidated the existing framework between the US and Europe that allows these data transfers to occur in a lawful way. So Without getting into all of the legal nuances surrounding this, essentially, in order to transfer this data, you have to look to other mechanisms under the GDPR, including things like your contracts that you have in place with your cloud vendors, like your Oracles and your Microsofts. And this is part of the role within the privacy function as well, is to ensure that we have those compliance mechanisms in place. Next slide, please. So one of the really key issues that comes up in the privacy space, and when we're talking about patient privacy, digital, virtual, is what is personal data? And so personal data under both the GDPR as well as under many of the US laws, including the new California law, is very, very broadly defined. And so this slide essentially lays that out, the idea that it could include any of these types of data, even things like images that could potentially identify someone would be personal data. In some cases, an IP address, an internet address, would be personal data as well. And so we have to consider the impact of privacy laws, not only with respect to identifiable patient data, but also things like which might not clearly identify someone, but when they are combined, when these elements are combined together, potentially they could identify someone. And so privacy laws still protect this type of data. Next slide, please. This is a visual graphic that I think demonstrates well what we call, essentially a spectrum of identifiability. So when we're talking about data as being, or personal information as being identifiable versus de-identified, it's not always clear what is identifiable that will be subject to the law and what is de-identified, which would not be subject to the law. And so what we see with these new technologies, new innovations, is oftentimes there's a view or there's an effort to de-identify data so that we can more freely use that data. And the question becomes, as a legal matter, is that data truly de-identified? And so we have this kind of gray area here when we're talking about pseudonymized data or de-identified versus anonymous. But it's whether or not it is truly de-identified will depend upon the applicable legal framework, will depend upon the technology that's used to de-identify that data, whether it's aggregated, et cetera. Next slide, please. So HIPAA is a complex law with it's a law. It also has a number of regulations under the HIPAA privacy law, which include, essentially can be broken down into three subsets: the privacy rule, the security rule, and the breach notification rule. One of the key aspects of HIPAA that's not well understood is that HIPAA does not apply to all health data. And so it only applies to a certain subset of health information, and that includes health information that is processed by covered entities. So your most typical or classic covered entity would be a physician or a hospital that would clearly be subject to HIPAA to the extent that they're engaged in patient transactions or transactions relating to patient healthcare. However, it also applies to health insurance plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and their business associates. So a business associate is essentially, it's a defined term under HIPAA, and it's a service provider or a vendor that is providing services to facilitate healthcare treatment or to facilitate the actions of these healthcare plans or healthcare clearinghouses. So it's not any vendor that's being contracted, but it is a certain subset that meet these defined definitions under HIPAA. So one of the issues that often comes up is the health data actually subject to HIPAA? In many cases, when we're talking about pharmaceutical personal information in the pharmaceutical industry, it's not, because pharmaceutical companies are not generally HIPAA covered entities. And so this has been identified as essentially a gap under US privacy laws, where there's a legislative gap where health information is not being protected. And this has been expressed as a concern from patient privacy advocates. Without getting into the details of surrounding is it or is it not covered by HIPAA, what we're seeing is now the laws and regulations are starting to try to fill those gaps. So the new California privacy law in some ways does that, and there are increasingly efforts to do that. And so we have to be careful when we're looking at health data and make some determinations as to, does HIPAA apply or does it not apply? And if it doesn't, Is there another law that might apply? And what do best practices dictate as well in terms of the protection of that data? Next slide, please. So I know this is a lot of information. There's a lot of legal technicalities here. And so, for the purposes of this presentation, just a high-level overview on the CCPA. The CCPA is the new California privacy law, which was recently enacted. It became effective in January of this year, and it became enforceable in July of this year. It's been quite complex in terms of the way that the law has evolved over time. There have now been 5 different sets of regulations that impose different requirements under the law, and those regulations are still being interpreted. And so those of us in the privacy field are essentially grappling with this new law, determining the impact on our businesses, and developing compliance plans to be in compliance with the law. But one of the things, or some of the things that the law does, is that it introduces new obligations, new elements that we've really never seen before in the US. And so some of those are laid out here. The right to access your data, the right to say no to the sale of your data or opt out of sales of data. We've never seen a right to opt out of sales of data really in any privacy law, including the European laws. So this is something that is challenging. It has to be reviewed across the organization to determine, do we implicate these requirements? And if so, what do we need to do to address them? Of course, HIPAA does include a right to access data, but because pharmaceutical companies and many other entities, within the pharmaceutical industry are not HIPAA-covered entities, this is a new requirement that needs to be essentially operationalized. So this right to access your data. So again, high-level overview. Next slide, please, because I know I have limited time today. But the scope of the CCPA is, essentially laid out here. It's broadly applicable to any company that meets any of these threshold requirements, which is really any substantially sized or at least large company and many of their vendors as well. Personal information is obviously also broadly defined, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide. So the CCPA has been a challenge, and now in addition to the CCPA, we have a very significant amendment to the CCPA, which is the Consumer Privacy Rights Act, CPRA. This introduces further requirements that bring the CCPA to a higher level of stringency, actually more in line with the European requirements. Some of these requirements are laid out here. And the one saving grace about the CPRA is that it's not effective until 2023. So we have, essentially significant amount of time to get into compliance. However, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done here to address these requirements. And there's also concerns from a regulatory enforcement and liability perspective, including because this new amendment, essentially the CCPA 2.0, also introduces a new enforcement arm, the California Privacy Protection Agency, separate and apart from the California Attorney General's office, charged with enforcement, which will have additional resources as well. So not only do we have the risk of regulatory enforcement, we also have the risk of litigation, private litigation, and we're already starting to see some lawsuits that are creeping up as well. So this is definitely something to keep our eyes on. Next slide, please. Just a high-level overview of the CCPA versus the CPRA. As you can see, CPRA introduces further requirements going beyond what we have under CCPA. So right to access your data was a right under CCPA, but now we have the right to restrict your processing of data, the right to object to the processing of your data. So there are additional rights here that are provided for, and we have to keep all of this in mind as we develop our data privacy compliance programs. Next slide, please. Okay, so I won't speak to all of this, but as you can see, there are further requirements under CPRA, and I think this slide does a nice job of comparing and contrasting these requirements. Next slide, please. So very briefly, CCPA has sort of taken hold, in a sense, with respect to other states being inspired by the CCPA, by this legislation. And there are many other states that are considering similar legislation, including Washington State, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and others. Many of these laws are similar to the CCPA. Many of them are also quite different, addressing certain areas relating to data privacy, but not as comprehensive as the CCPA. So all of this has to be monitored as the legislation develops. None of these, or for the most part, most of these laws have not made a lot of progress right now, in part because of the COVID era. Everything has slowed down, but we do expect to see more of these laws enacted within the next couple of years. Next slide. Okay, next, please. Okay, so this is my final slide, and then we can take questions or just take questions at the end as well. So essentially, with respect to real-world evidence and patient data, there are clear implications regarding electronic health records, patient registries, mobile applications, wearable devices, online forums, and social media. And we're seeing more and more of this within the pharmaceutical industry. How do we access electronic health records in a way that's lawful, in a way that's ethical, and make use of that data? And it's, similarly with respect to patient registries or mobile applications, wearable devices. There's more and more collection of data, and we have to keep these laws and regulations in mind as we develop, as these new projects and initiatives come to fruition. And so this is the role of, within privacy compliance. It's important to monitor this space, for your privacy officers to be engaged with business colleagues. And I think, that pretty much sums it up in terms of the RWE implications for the purposes of this presentation. And again, happy to take questions, but at this point, I think I will turn it over to Craig.
Thanks, Corey. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a data privacy expert, but I am a drug developer, a clinical trialist, a patient, and an advocate. And so I'm hoping to share some complementary perspectives to those that Corey has laid out as foundational knowledge in this area, and hopefully to lay out at least one or two paths to the future that may create what I consider sustainability in our models for how we can continue to access vital electronic health data and diverse data to support medical research in ways that are consistent with expectations of patients and the sources of those data. Next slide, please. The challenges in medical research and clinical trials today are largely well characterized. I've tried to include three general themes here. First off, life sciences companies around the world today are increasing their emphasis on patient recruitment, engagement, and diversity and representation along that journey. Secondly, there are significant investments happening today that focus on the challenges of data acquisition and integrity. How we capture data for most of our prospective research studies involves a significant amount of burden and redundancy, requiring a significant amount of investment around data quality and integrity. And then finally, the challenges around having confidence in cost and quality and in process, areas that have created great opportunities to introduce automation and other innovations in the clinical research process. Next slide. As we think about opportunities for patient-generated data within the clinical research enterprise, and that can be data that's generated by the patient through soliciting for information such as surveys, and ECOA, patient-reported outcomes. It can be through patients using different types of wearables and connected devices, but also through patients being able to access and share their electronic health records and other electronic health data prospectively into clinical research studies. And when patients are able to bring that data into studies, there are a number of use cases that solve some of those key challenges in clinical research today. And so some of this might be how we think about patient-centered registries and how might we start to reimagine registries, which today fall into a few different quadrants. Some registries today are involving patients as their stakeholder, but often involve a significant amount of manual effort and manual data entry. Other registries may involve physicians or providers and try to create connections into health records. But we don't have that many registry models today that we can point to where patients are the stakeholder, but the process of data collection is simplified by empowering those patients to bring their data into those ecosystems. And so we can start to reimagine what registries look like when the patients whose data we're interested in become data enabled and are able to bring that data into these studies. We can start to relook at our challenges around study enrollment, whether the screening process, evaluations of eligibility, and so on, when patients have better and consistent and rich access to their electronic health data. When they can bring that data into the screening process, we can then start to use different types of artificial intelligence and even other basic digital platforms that can help support evaluating which studies are right for which patients, but doing it in a way that's inclusive of the patient rather than simply relying on aggregated de-identified data, which doesn't necessarily solve for recruitment because we can't engage an identifiable human on the other side. When patients have access to their health data, we can start to find radical step changes in the efficiency of collecting data and capturing data in our studies through the concept of electronically sourced data. The idea that study data does not have to be re-entered by investigators and study staff, but instead patients can bring their data into the trial electronically from trusted sources with audit trails and remove some of the redundant data entry and introduce more quality by design into our studies. That diversity of data then starts to create opportunities for us to realize some of our aspirations around precision medicine through the ability to collect far more diverse data than we otherwise might have anticipated. When patients are able to connect to that health data, we can also start to address some of our concerns around long-term safety data through models such as tokenization, where patients can share more consistent, sticky access to their electronic health data. How might that start to address some of our challenge, for example, around the long-term safety of gene therapies, where today we may want to follow patients for 7, 10 years or even longer. Challenging in terms of retention, even for shorter duration studies, but how might connections to electronic health data authorized by the patient address some of those? There's a great deal of enthusiasm around synthetic control arms today, and certainly models have been emerging where research sponsors are able to create synthetic control arms, finding patient data typically from aggregated data sets, patients that meet the eligibility criteria for a particular study, and where sponsors have some really exciting opportunities to be able to create alternatives to the burden of placebo control in a given trial. A burden because patients want to enroll in studies just to be in a control arm, and a burden where collecting substantial amounts of control arm data brings substantial cost and burden into a trial. But how might we rethink that model of synthetic controls when we're able to identify individual patients who are willing to share deep, rich, diverse health data in a permissioned way to populate those control arms? And then finally, there's an exciting space emerging around our ability to improve our engagement with patients by making data sharing bidirectional, so that not only are patients sharing their data into a study, but the study can share more of the data collected and the learnings that were aggregated back with those individuals in the studies. Next slide. There are two priorities that most life sciences companies have been considering today. And you'll see this in many of the different annual meetings and presentations and in the words and signals that life sciences companies are putting out. One is on their urgency to be closer to patients, patient engagement, and patient centricity. And the second is around the aspiration to be data-driven organizations, where all of their employees and colleagues can become citizen data scientists, and where their R&D organizations are better and smarter and faster, powered by R&D. But there's concern that's starting to emerge as to whether these two priorities are starting to diverge. Next slide, and we'll talk a bit about what that means. And to me, one of the best ways to explore what that means is by looking at the lessons from the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. Because in 1951, her cervical cells became available to research as a byproduct of her care. They were retained without her explicit awareness and permission. And while they made an incredibly positive impact to all of us through research, there was no transparency with the source. And when I look at how personal health data is being used and transacted today, personal health data from electronic health records, from all of our experiences and interactions in healthcare today, it's being used as an available byproduct of our care and our health interactions. It's often being retained and shared without explicit awareness and engagement with the patients who've provided it. It's making an incredibly positive and profound impact on research through learning health systems and many of the use cases we've been talking about, but we're still missing the same thing we were missing 60 years ago with Henrietta Lacks in terms of engagement and transparency with the source and how that information is being used. Next slide. My concern that I'm raising by sharing this story is around the sustainability of our current models for how we're using individuals' health data at a time when communities, people, are becoming increasingly sensitized to their data use. As Corey was mentioning earlier, consumers are becoming aware in California about new laws and what those might mean for them. And many of those types of laws came as a result of many of these headlines that I'm sharing here, some of which begin in the misuse of social media information, but as Corey mentioned a moment ago, start to pull into stories about how technology companies and others may be using an individual's data without their knowledge. That bottom left example is actually an article of mine about that concept of a digital twin and in what situations are researchers able to use my personal health data to create a digital twin of me, an electronic rendering of everything about me, and use that data to create a participant in a control arm of a clinical trial. And at what point in this process should we pause and reflect if it's appropriate to use a digital instance of me to enroll in a study without my permission? Next slide, please. Researchers are voracious for data, and the best source of aggregated and diverse data about an individual patient turns out to be the patients themselves. Because while we as researchers can turn to different aggregated data sources and try our best to make privacy preserving connections across those data sets to learn as much as we can about individuals, in fact, the best way to get the most diverse data about an individual is through the individual themselves, and to do so in a permissioned way by actively engaging with people rather than focusing as much as we do in the research community today upon aggregated data sources that don't include the patient in the process. whether it's molecular data, imaging data, self-reported social determinants of health, and so on. The patient is the best source. And fortunately for researchers, 9 out of 10 patients turn out to be willing to share their health data to support research. Over 9 out of 10 when we've seen surveys from activated patients at patients like me, or parents of children at Boston Children's Hospital, or mainstream patients surveyed by the Makovsky Group. The consistent theme is patients are willing to share to support research as long as their data is used consistent with their privacy wishes. Next slide. And so in conclusion, I think it's important for us as in the research community to consider what sustainable models will look like for us to have confidence that the era of our being able to learn as much as we do today through being able to access the diversity of health data that we are privileged to today does not get shut off, that we don't lose that access because we're not including patients and people in the process. And so it's incumbent on the research community to advocate for policies that support access for data by patients, transparency in terms of how data is being used, develop and champion models that are inclusive with patients so that wherever feasible, we're seeking data through permission channels rather than exclusively relying on aggregated data, not necessarily with explicit permissions, and to use our influence to prioritize that. I think we can learn a lot even from looking at the simplicity of credit reports and how you and I in the United States are able to access our credit report, have transparency in terms of who else has used it, and to be able to turn it off and lock that credit report if we don't want others to be able to use it. Next slide, and I'll stop here and look forward to a conversation with you and the questions that are on your mind. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig and Corey, for your presentations. We've gotten a lot of questions come in, and there's already a number of them that have been answered live. So check those out in case you in case I don't get to one of the questions. It may already have been answered. But I wanted to kick off with one question about it's an excellent slide. I think, Corey, this was one of your slides showing the reality of the gray space between identifiable and anonymous. And rare disease, in the rare disease space, it's very difficult to characterize data as truly anonymous. What controls, particularly technological controls, do you recommend to protect privacy when sharing record level data beyond minimizing the information shared and having data sharing agreements? And then in particular, any special considerations for the rare disease community?
Sure, happy to answer that question. And it's a really good one. It does come up often, especially in the rare disease space. And so I did paste a link in the chat box to the NIST guidance on this in terms of anonymization or de-identification of data. So there are some technological considerations here. And in many cases, you can use an expert determination method, which is one of the methods under HIPAA. But really under HIPAA, there's two ways to de-identify data. There's the safe harbor method, which is sort of a blunt method of removal of all of the 18 identifiers. And then there's the expert determination method, which involves a statistical expert. But some of the ways that we can do this include the removal of direct identifiers. You can redact the data, you can aggregate the data, you can use encryption of the data. So there are a number of ways to do this from a technical perspective. But in order to ensure that it is effectively de-identified, oftentimes there's a statistical methodology that can be used, and it will also involve the review of a privacy officer as well. In the rare disease space, obviously, there are some concerns regarding the fact that these patients are, have rare conditions. And so that introduces some challenges in terms of, is the data truly de-identified? Because they have, identifiable conditions and characteristics. And so often we have sort of a higher level of scrutiny with respect to rare disease patients and making sure that that data is de-identified as well.
Thanks. And another question, and I like this phrase, I've never heard it before, isn't the toothpaste out of the tube, so to speak? There's so much data already in the hands of those who would use it for research purposes. So how can organizations who would propel research and accelerate novel therapies still instill trust in its future consumers, as well as the general population?
That's a great question. Craig, would you like to take that one?
The toothpaste does seem to be out of the tube, but toothpaste goes stale here pretty quickly, right? Toothpaste is out of the tube in that a lot of our data is already out there and it's already being shared through different ecosystems. But there is a temporality to that data that researchers are dependent upon. And so while our data is out of the tube, the half-life on that toothpaste starts to tick away. There's a freshness that's required in terms of contemporary data, and without maintaining the pipelines, without ensuring that there is a constant feed of new data, the information there starts to lose its value very quickly. It loses its value because there are new standards of care, new norms and standards in the communities in terms of practice. And so it's for that reason that I don't think we can take our eye off the ball in terms of the go-forward models that may be most sustainable, simply because we have such rich and seemingly unfettered access today. I think we can get very comfortable as researchers today with as much data there is that seems to be available all around us. And I don't think we can settle and take that comfort for granted right now.
Thanks. Another question is, if patients choose whether to volunteer their data, do you foresee any problems with analyses, but also potential for bias? If certain types of folks may be more likely to even be aware that they can volunteer their data for research purposes, how can we be sure that we're not perpetuating underlying biases in the data that we're analyzing for research? I will pose that maybe first to Craig and then Corey.
It's a very important question. I suppose one of the first lens that I might consider is it's hard to find data sets that don't have some level of bias. Certainly most all prospectively acquired data sets, it's very hard for us to sit back and simply let the universe play out and expect that the data that comes back is truly representative. We know that we have to work certain levers harder than others to ensure that our data sets are truly diverse and representative. But very often, even when we're operating with aggregated and de-identified data, depending on the source that we're turning to, may actually also suggest just how diverse, inclusive, and representative that data may actually be. I think that when we look at these models to be able to engage prospectively and proactively with individuals, it does give us the opportunity to be able to influence the mix of individuals that we have to make sure that we're achieving the diversity and inclusiveness that we're looking for. Take, for example, just how COVID-19 vaccine trials have played out this year. The diversity probably would not have been there without the additional effort to generate the mix that we are looking for.
I think that was well said, Craig. What I would add to that is that within the privacy space, there are also some issues in terms of what do our consent forms say, and how are we opting in individuals, and also providing the right level of transparency. And so there is some potential to introduce bias based upon what the requirements are within the consent forms. And we have to be careful with respect to that, but also ensure that we're being transparent with people about how their information is being used and disclosed, even if the information is being provided voluntarily.
Thank you, Corey and Craig. Perhaps one final question is about case examples about aggregating health data by going directly to patients. Craig, do you have any case examples or leaders in this particular area that we would be able to point folks towards?
You know, I think there are probably two interesting ways we can start to look at that. One would be just even within the context of prospective clinical trials today. We see models emerging I'll point to an example, a collaboration of Datavant and ParExcel to enable tokenization for clinical trial participants to be able to link and bring in their otherwise aggregated de-identified health data in a way that's privacy preserving but consistent with their wishes. And so we start to see these models emerging where a prospective patient consenting and participating in a trial can bring their real world data into that study in a permissioned way. But then to the point of this question, we also see other models that really take advantage of communities and even the concept of a registry of patients in a fresh and new way. And we see models out there with some advocacy groups that have patients around a particular disease area, such as breast cancer, that are partnering with entities that can data enable their patients. Third parties, companies like Citizen and others that are able to take their platform and enable that community of patients to become data enabled, to be able to link and bring in their diverse health data, and to be able to share it with researchers. And so I think that model can make a lot of sense. We have existing communities of patients, we have legacy registry models, how we might data enable those groups of patients to be able to share their data in a permission way into research studies sets a pretty clear path for us in terms of an operating model.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all of the questions. I will just make one plug. I saw the last question was about trust in research and trust in science. We'll be having our focus for the next year will be on trust in science and trustworthiness in science within the National Health Council's Chief Scientific and Medical Officer group. So we will certainly be touching upon that particular topic over the coming year. But with that, I wanted to just really thank Craig and Corey for your presentations. Thank you everyone for joining us today. All of the resources that were described during the presentation and then also that were in the chat will be available on our website, the same website that you registered for today's webinar on. So take a look at that and feel free to reach out to us with any questions, ideas for future topics. We are very happy to take them. So again, thank you so much, Craig and Corey. We really appreciate it. And thank you for everybody who attended today. We wish you a really nice weekend.